Delightful to see you. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm always so happy to have you here, as you know. Hi. But to begin with, I want to say thanks, everybody. Thanks so much for coming to our little webinar on oak. And we're going to talk about the wonder of wooden barrels, you guys, because man, they're really, it's actually a fascinating part of wine culture and such a ubiquitous I mean, you cannot get away from drinking wine without the presence or the acknowledgement of oak or no oak, honestly. And these days, it's really a matter of like, is it talking about how much oak there is or how much oak there isn't? And I think the definitely as of a recent in the past decade or so, I mean, there's been such, especially in those white wines, and even in a lot of reds too, such a draw away from oak because it has such a powerful effect on wine. And when and how you choose to use it as a winemaker is absolutely integral to the ability of your wines to present what you want and be the wine that you want it to be. So without further ado, let's chat a little bit about oak. And the history of oak, of course, because oak wasn't always the vessel of choice, if you will, right? So when we talk about wine, of course, we're talking about millennia of evolution in terms of this beverage, how it's made, how it's drank. But mostly we're talking about the wine culture as we talk about it mostly today does begin well into sort of the Phoenician culture, pre-Greeks, all in that Mesopotamian era, if you will. And then you have ultimately the rise of wine viticulture, right? Because originally all of these vines were, of course, just wild, and grapes were not hermaphroditic, which they are now, so they did have to be pollinated. But eventually, the grapevine Vitis vinifera became hermaphroditic, which means that it can pollinate itself, which makes it a really awesome crop to grow. And this is part of what you're doing into the, the evolution of wine as a crop, right? Because it became not just fun to drink, but it was really a means of economic development, and it was a means of productivity for culture. So of course, the Romans are what we use as our benchmark of kind of the beginning of wine culture and sort of the evolution of creating the viticulture industry, if you will, built into that culture. Because the Romans pretty much brought wine everywhere they went, and they went pretty much everywhere, right? They started out down there in Italy, and then they moved up and basically dominated the entire European continent. Now, originally, when the Romans were just beginning, and even prior to that, clay amphora, which are those beautiful kind of like, oblong-y shaped. Oftentimes they had a point at the bottom because they would sit in these stands as opposed to like on the ground, but they were transported in what these clay amphora are. And that for a long time was the prime vessel for both aging wine and also storing it and transporting it. It was able to be sealed. There was wood back in sort of the Roman days in the early Roman culture, but ultimately the wood that was used was pine. Palm wood. And this was in the Mesopotamia kind of area. And the palm wood that the Mesopotamians were using was not ideal for transportation or for water tightness. As it turns out, palm is not a very pliable wood, so it wouldn't have the kind of air tightness and water tightness that was needed in order to hold wine for a long period of time or transport it over distances. Whereas clay, of course, was pottery has been around for a very, very long time, and clay was very good at being water sealed, watertight, and it was still difficult, but you could seal it and make sure that it didn't spill out, unless of course the clay was cracked or broken. But ultimately, this was the dominant. It was heavy though, and this was always a kind of a big problem. But ultimately, what happened was, as the Romans sort of made their way into Europe, and they got to sort of northern European region, kind of like northern France, you have the Gauls. That was sort of the tribes, those sort of like many, many different tribes that kind of existed up in northern Europe and northern France and even a little bit in Spain. And the Gauls were, they didn't drink wine, they didn't make wine, they made beer. as it turns out. So the Gauls have there's a couple things they had going for them that the Romans did not, which is that in Europe, for example, specifically in France, and we'll talk about that a lot today, oak was very, very prominent. It was very available. There were lots of oak forests, and they had found early on that they were able to make these barrels from the trees, from the woods that were naturally occurring around them. So that was very, very useful for the Gaul, and they were able to use that to hold their beer that they were making, because they were further north. They were coming from a region where grapes didn't necessarily grow that well, but you know what does grow really well up in the north, if anyone's a fan of Scotch or whiskey, grains are very, very much better suited for that cooler climate. Therefore, they would make beer as opposed to wine, because the grapes were so much more prolific down further south. So at this point, the Romans sort of meet the Gauls, and then they say, hey, this is awesome. This oak stuff is so much lighter than the clay amphora. We're totally taking this. And within about 200 years or so, they had pretty much just dropped all the clay amphora that they were using and just transferred everything into wood. Now, a lot of the initial wood, again, like it took some time to figure that out. A lot of times we refer to especially in the Italian, like the early Italian wines and stuff, poor wood barrels, and we'll talk about this, but for transportation and storage and stuff, would allow too much oxygen into the wines, which would ultimately make the wines spoil and not hold well. But a well-made barrel, man, it is kind of the best thing for holding that wine, helping it evolve, making it the best that it can be. You know, it's like its own personal trainer of wine in a barrel. So ultimately, that was why it became the vessel of choice. And then it's really stayed, I mean, oak has been and remained sort of the dominant vessel, both for maturation, fermentation, and transportation for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, all the way really into the 20th century, was when we started getting more into using more of the steel, and the sort of revisiting ancient methods like your cement tanks and like your stainless steel was obviously not ancient, but is new. So the evolution has sort of come all the way around, as it always does, but oak still has, over its usage, proven that it has much more to offer than just a vessel as a vessel. So now, like I was saying, man, this is a huge topic, and I was like, this will be great to chat about, but it's a lot. So we're going over just some of the basics. But when we talk about the types of oak that are generally used in winemaking, we have three main species of oak, if you will, and really two are from the same family, and one is a completely different species. But French oak, which is really European oak, there are two different families, the Quercus robur and the Quercus petrea. These are both found sort of all the way throughout your sort of European forests. So this is the Baltics, this is the England, France, northern Spain a little bit. It does go down into Italy, but these are the main woods that you're going to find, and these are the main woods that have been used historically for winemaking, and continue to use today. It's very, very particular. Especially in France, because we talk a lot about French oak, and we'll talk about why that ends up coming up more so than others, but French oak is really one of the species of European oaks. And then American white oak is a totally different family. So this is Quercus alba. And the American oak is basically grown sort of in the eastern side of the United States. And you can see that it's basically kind of like, the eastern seaboard. You've got a little bit of the Midwest in there. And this Quercus alba, this is the wood that is used for one of my favorite beverages. I'm sure other people enjoy it as well, but bourbon. It's part of the regulation of bourbon as an actual spirit. It is required to be aged in new charred American oak barrels, and you cannot reuse those barrels. So this is a huge industry in the eastern United States, and it is a huge industry that creates a lot of used barrels as well, which is what you see oftentimes being sent across the seas to go ahead and be used in things like whiskeys, like scotches, like sherries. The reuse of those barrels, since bourbon, once it's been used, cannot use it again. This is not the same for wine barrels, of course. Wine barrels can be used multiple times, and all the way they can last for up to 200 years, these barrels, when they're well made. But it is the question of whether or not you want to use them for that long, depending on what your goals are for what they offer, and we're going to talk about what that is. Now, a couple of other types of oak that you'll see, there are lots and lots of different types of oak and lots of different types of wood, but a lot of times, I'd say two of the most common other oaks that you'll see sometimes on labels, for example, Hungarian oak. And Hungarian oak is actually very, very popular. So Hungarian oak is in the same family. It's that same sort of, it's the Quercus robur and the Quercus petrea, mostly the Quercus petrea. And the Hungarian oak ends up being, it was actually the main oak that was used for barrels all the way up until the 1940s. It was highly prized. There's an actual forest that's known as the Zemplén Mountains. And this is also the Zemplén Mountains are where this sort of highly prized Hungarian oak was sourced from for a very, very long time, pretty much until the Russian Revolution. And then that's when trade sort of stopped and the refocus went towards the French oak. When the Spanish use American oak, it is used in bourbon barrels or New American white oak. Oftentimes, so the Spanish, when we're talking about, it depends on what you're talking about, right? So a lot of times sherry will have used American oak from used barrels or used bourbon, ex-bourbon, but the actual Rioja barrels are oftentimes unused, and they're new American oak that they will bring over. The option is, of course, up to the winemaker. I'm not sure about, in terms of Rioja, if it's regulated that the barrels are have to be new. They obviously don't have to be new, but that's a good question, Dan, and I can get back to you on that. But for the most part, it's usually not necessarily, the used bourbon barrels are usually put towards the sherries a lot of times, and not so much, because the sherry is sort of a more, the process is so much more lengthy, if you will, that the question is whether or not that bourbon is going to infect or kind of infect is not the word I was looking for, but introduce different new flavors and different properties to the wine that you're coming out with. But the ultimate thing, a question for that is a good one. That's a really funny answer to your question. Sorry, Dan. Anyway, but talking about Hungarian oak really quickly again, we're talking about kind of this idea that Hungarian oak was highly prized, and it's also part of the kind of like Russian oak. Like Russian oak is oftentimes referred to as well, and sometimes will be seen on labels. And again, these are all still part of that European oak, those European oak families, the Quercus robur and the Quercus petrea. Slovenian oak is often used as well. This is usually as the Quercus robur family. The Slavonian oak is oftentimes more used for the larger barrels as opposed to the small ones. This is part because of the grain, and this is something that I was just mentioning, but at the top of this, we talk about the grain a lot, and this is really, thank you, Ken. Yes, infused was the word I was looking for. So when we talk about the grain of the wood, it's the same thing as whenever you cut a piece of wood, you can kind of see on the edge of it, that's the grain. And the grain is really referring to sort of the annual growth cycles of an individual tree. And so the tightness or the looseness of a grain is indicative of how that tree was grown, what kind of climate it was grown in, how hot it was in a particular year, how much water there was in a particular year. So when we think about growing trees for these barrels that we're using to make wine, it's incredible, because once you start getting into oak, the sort of the fine minutia details of how these barrels are created, what the trees are, where they're grown, how these barrels are produced, all of these individual small little nuanced decisions have huge effects on the barrel's ability and what it translates into the wines that we drink. So a lot of times when we're talking about wine, we're just talking about kind of the winemaker and what the winemaker chooses to do, even in the vineyard or the vigneron and all the way to that. But it's a whole separate family that's equally as important and equally as diverse and detailed as winemaking itself. So it's absolutely an entire form of study, which is really incredible. So so your Hungarian oak and your Slavonian oak oftentimes are seen on the label as well. And the grain, the tighter grain actually releases more kind of aromatic compounds over time than the wide grain. And the wide grain will oftentimes release more wood tannins into the wine. And it's interesting because you would think a tighter grain wine actually allows less oxygen into it. So we're going to talk about how wood allows oxygen into the wine as one of its properties that's useful for winemaking. But the reality is that a tighter grain actually allows more oxygenation to occur with the wine than a looser grain. And this has to do with sort of the porosity of the wood and the ratio of the grain to the porosity. It's very, very fascinating. But bottom line, without getting into too much detail, the tighter grain, you actually get more oxygenation through a tighter grain than you do from a looser grain. And in this particular situation, when we're looking at, oftentimes you'll hear with French oak versus American oak, French oak tends to have a tighter grained wood than American oak. And these are that's one of the main differences that we talk about a lot when we're talking about the comparison between the two. So the next step, obviously, we have our wood, we have the various forests that it comes from specifically that winemakers will actually go out to the forest with their coopers, and coopers are the people who make the barrels. They will go out to the forests, they will find trees and mark specific trees that they want their barrels to be made out of. This is the kind of relationship that a lot of winemakers actually have with their coopers, because they so incredibly value what those barrels will do for their wine in the end. And it's an incredible, incredible relationship to be able to have, and to be able to speak to kind of how important this aspect of winemaking is for a winemaker. So when you have the process of making a barrel, you have a tree, you cut it down, you then have to cut the wood into what are called staves. And those are the individual sort of parts of the barrel that are then put together into the barrel itself, but those individual sort of planks, right? The interesting thing about different oaks is that they cut on different, you're able to cut them differently. So it's French oak, the European oaks actually have to be cut along their grain very specifically in order for them to be usable. This makes them a little bit more expensive because it's more of a hand process. It's not a process that can be mechanized. Whereas American oak, you can actually saw the wood into those planks, which allows for easier mechanization and allows for cheaper wood. So that's one of the reasons why American wood tends to be more expensive than French barrels. So American barrels and French barrels, oftentimes French barrels are about twice as expensive, we'll talk about that too, than American barrels. And one of those reasons is because the French barrels, the wood is actually you must be hand cut. So once you've cut the staves, what you do is you season the wood. And this is a very, very important process for the wood. This can take up to 3, sometimes even 5 years, that you have these staves sort of sitting in stacks outside. And they want the wood to be seasoned in the open. It's called seasoning, is allowing the wood to basically air dry, just like you would with beef, like dry aged beef is the way to kind of think about it, which is very fascinating. But it's very interesting because this is the time that the wood is allowed to dry out, to season in the open air. They absolutely have, it is sort of the ability for the wood to process the tannins that are naturally in the oak, to soften them and make them sort of more enjoyable for the ultimate wine experience. They don't actually mold in the rainy weather. So that's the amazing thing about wood. And it is these planks, they do get wet and then they dry, but over time, it's sort of a longer process. The aging of the wood, they don't mold. You can sometimes get a little bit I'm sure there's some sort of moss that can sometimes occur, but generally speaking, they have very specific paddocks. You can kind of see there the way that it's all stacked. It's really just about kind of the heat, the sun, and the fresh air that allows that to happen. And that there is no kind of, it's not left out long enough in areas to biodegrade, if you will, but they definitely have them. So that's part of it too, right? Because it's kind of like this process. Exactly. So it's not just about drying it out. It's about allowing it to season. So it is sort of like the same way when we talk about when you think about a vine growing, we talk about the length of the growing season and how the longer that grape is allowed to ripen, sort of the more it's able to produce more intense concentrated flavors, more characteristics. So with wood, I mean, you don't necessarily, you want the length of time for it to dry, because there's the seasoning outdoors for about 3 to 5 years is what's going to be ideal for making that wood the best possible wood for making wine and for making wine barrels. So for example, you could take this wood, and this often happens with American oak, and you can kiln dry it. You can take this wood, you can just throw it in a kiln, which takes a fraction of the time to get it to the right amount of moisture. But what it's doing is it's kind of sucking the tannins. It's not allowing the tannins that are naturally in the wood to age and develop in the wood, so that those tannins that are then introduced to the wine are equally as soft and sort of pliable and delicious. So this kind of situation where it's like they're outside, let's say they start getting too dry. You don't want them to dry out. You want them to sort of dry slowly. So you might go ahead and reintroduce a little bit of that water to them to give them a little bit more time to dry, because ultimately it's not about how fast they can dry, it's about how long it takes for them to get to the perfect amount of dryness. So that's part of the reason why you see here they're re-wetting the wood. Maybe it's a very, very dry summer right now, and they don't want to over dry the wood, because then that would stop the process of the tannins breaking down in the wood and make them less ideal for the barrels. Isn't that crazy? I mean, it's absolutely, these are no longer in the ground, but you're sort of growing them as a cooper. You're seasoning them. It's like growing and cooking your wood at the perfect amount of time for the length of time, like a stew, right? You want it to be long, you want it to be slow. So they do that outside, and they have to be able to regulate that as needed. So the next part is, after you've air dried or seasoned your staves, you then have to make the barrel. And this involves doing of the process of heating the wood so that those staves then become pliable and can be shaped into that barrel form. And the process of heating that wood is called toasting. The amount of time that the barrel spends over an open flame, like that barrel that we see in this picture, that's basically an open, it has like, it's like fingers, but it's like together at the top. That barrel is over an open flame for anywhere from 20 minutes to like 45 minutes or longer. The longer it's on there, the more that inside of the barrel gets toasted. The actual wood starts to turn into charcoal. A charred oak barrel is basically charcoal on the inside. But what that does is the toasting of the inside of the barrel makes the wood pliable so it can be shaped into a barrel form. It releases chemical compounds into the front layers that will be like connecting to the wine itself. And again, if you actually char that and turn it into charcoal, charcoal is a filter. So that can remove color and different chemical aspects from the wine while it's aged in there. So you have to be very careful. The amount of toast that the barrel has will have a direct impact on what kind of flavor and what kind of tannins are introduced into the wine. So the lighter toast wines, the lighter toast barrels tend to put more of the natural tannin in the wood that's already existing in the wood into the wine as it's either fermented or aged in it. And the heavier the toast, so that you get more of that kind of like toasty, spicy characteristics coming out of the wood into the wine. So the thing is when we talk about using these oak barrels with wine, it adds aromas, it adds flavors, and it changes the structure of the wine, which is what we're going to talk about on the next one. So the effects on wine are, as I just mentioned, it's not a single thing that it does. Oak has a multifaceted effect on wine. It is a vessel that is watertight, but it is not airtight. So oak is used, we know this, oak is used on white wines, it's used on red wines, it can be used on some rosé wines, not always. And why is that? There's a few reasons, because of the properties of oak usage during winemaking that are sometimes desirable and sometimes not desirable, depending on what kind of wine you want to make. So it introduces oxygen to the wine, because while we are totally watertight and the wine itself is not leaking out of the barrel, it is an organic material that allows for oxygenation to travel through the surface, through the staves into the wine and interact with the wine that's inside of the barrel. This does not happen if you're aging your wine or fermenting your wine in stainless steel. Stainless steel is inert. It allows for no oxygen contact with the wine, but oak does allow for oxygen to interact with the wine during its use. And this is a huge part, because what does that do? This very, 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 very tiny amounts of oxygen that are introduced do a couple of things. It helps to allow that wine to start to develop. It's oxidation, essentially. And the process of turning wine into vinegar is literally that. It's oxidation, right? You introduce oxygen to the wine and it basically turns into vinegar. But the evolution of that process is what ends up with what's in our glass that we absolutely love, which is so fascinating, right? So this idea is that this very, very slow amount, this very, very tiny amount of oxygen that comes in through the oak does a couple things. Oxidation of the wines reduces fruit flavor just a little bit. It reduces natural acidity just a little bit. This means that the sort of bright, fresh fruit flavors start to turn into more of those earthier fruit flavors. They can turn into more of like a softer kind of potentially smoky fruit flavor, almost maybe a jammy fruit flavor, depending on that, just because of the oxygen interacting with it, because it's taking away a little bit of that freshness. It's oxidizing it, just like when you leave an apple out on a counter and that surface starts to brown. That's sort of the oxidation process. It's not bad in small amounts, and it actually helps to stabilize the wine as well sometimes, in just those small amounts that it introduces. The other thing is that oak itself, as we mentioned, has tannins in it. So tannins are a natural part of the oak that will then be extracted into the wine, because there's alcohol in the wine, and alcohol is a solvent, and it will pull the tannins that are naturally in the wood and introduce them and integrate the tannins into the wine. And this is important sometimes, because maybe you want that to happen because your wine doesn't have a lot of tannins and you want to add a little bit more of that structure to the wine. You can get that from oak. But you have to be careful, because the level of toast will indicate how much of those tannins are going to be introduced. If you have a very light toasted barrel, again, we talked about that, there's more of those wood tannins that come into the wine. Now, what if your barrel is lightly toasted, but then it was like kiln dried, so those tannins aren't as developed, right? They're more harsh in the wood. Then you're introducing harsher wood tannins into your wine. So that's where you have to be careful. You have to understand what kind of tannin is in the oak to begin with, so you can understand how that's going to affect the wine that is being fermented or aged in the barrel. And then your new oak versus neutral oak, another thing we'll talk about. But when you toast a barrel and you age your wine, or you use it for winemaking, it imparts the most flavor and effect on the wine with that initial usage. With each passing usage, its effect on the wine diminishes greatly in terms of flavor and tannin extraction. By the time a barrel has been used 3, sometimes even on the second use, but usually around your third or fourth use, that barrel no longer adds any flavors to the wine. It no longer adds any tannins to the wine. It becomes a neutral barrel. It's different from a stainless steel because it still allows the oxygen in there, but it doesn't allow any tannin or flavor to be extracted into the wine. So that's also really important to kind of understand how old that oak is in terms of how it affects the wine's flavor and aroma. Because all of these things are affecting, like we're talking about, the aroma. Are you getting the smell from the new oak? Are you getting the smell of vanilla? Are you getting the smell of coconut, dill, spice, clove, coffee? All of these kind of descriptors that we use for oak that come from mostly new oak, because that is part of that process of that toasting that's being sort of dissolved and integrated into the wine. Or are you just kind of getting a slightly less freshness of the fruit, a little bit more texture because of the oxygenation that's coming through a neutral oak barrel? These are the two different things to kind of consider and look at. And also that oxygenation is part of what changes the color of the wine. So for example, more easily seen in white wines, for example, than red wines perhaps, but when white wines start to age, when oxygen is introduced to white wines, you start to see a change in color. It gets more golden, more yellow. And this is due to the interaction of oxygen with the wine. Whereas, you know, if you have a Chardonnay that's been aged in oak versus a Chardonnay that's been aged entirely in stainless steel, you're going to see a drastic difference in the color of that. Now, age also plays a part in the color, but overall, what we're talking about with oak is how the oxygen affects that. So using oak when you're a winemaker and now you've gotten your barrel, it's been made, you've buddied up with your cooper and gotten your perfect barrel, and now it's here in your winery. And how do you use it? You have to be very careful, because all of these aspects, like we talked about, they all have different impacts on the wine, and each grape is going to react differently to different types of oak usage and different points at which that oak is used. So the point at which oak is introduced into the winemaking process also has a direct impact on how it affects the wine. There are basically, you can, as a winemaker, introduce oak whenever you want. You can start off your wine by fermenting in an oak. You can ferment it in oak and then age it in stainless steel. You can ferment it in stainless steel and then age it in oak. There's another part of the process after fermentation called malolactic fermentation, which we've never talked about. It's going to be another one, but you've got definitely this idea of, if you take your white wine or your red wine and you want to ferment it in the barrel, that's going to kind of help the integration of the oak flavors during that fermentation process, because yeasts, while they're fermenting the sugars into alcohol, will also start to uptake a little bit of those oak elements. And then they will sort of integrate those into the process of fermentation, creating sort of nuanced little side effects and sort of side characteristics into the wine that will have an effect ultimately on the wine and help it to kind of integrate those oak flavors into the whole process, right? It's like, when do you add salt to a soup? Do you add it at the beginning? Do you add seasoning at the beginning, at the middle, at the end? If you think of oak usage as kind of like seasoning your wine, when you add it can make a huge difference in how it gets integrated into the final product. Does wine that has been aged in barrel leave a residue and infuse subsequent wines used in that barrel? A lot of times, to be honest, all barrels are cleaned. So if they're being reused, you have to clean those barrels out. It's a pain in the butt, man. But they do scrub them down, and they can be used. Most of the time, what happens with like white wines, you'll get like a crust of tartrate crystals that will happen. But most of the time, barrels are cleaned out very thoroughly between usage, and you don't really get a lot of, you can, because the truth of the matter is that as oxygen is pushed into the wine is pushed into the barrel. So if anyone's ever seen a multi-use stave, a stave from a wine barrel in a red wine that's been used many times, it will be stained. It will be stained red. So you can't deny that there's still wine in there. How much that really affects the following wines depends on what you're putting in there. If you aged a Malbec for like 10 years in a barrel and then you want to use it on like a Riesling, you're going to have some sort of impact from that, right? You just can't get away from that. So ultimately, you're not using those kind of neutral barrels, or you're not using sort of, you have to judiciously choose to use those barrels, because they can actually affect the resulting wines, but to a much lesser degree than what the actual, if you were mixing that wine in with it. So it's small, but yes, it can definitely leave, have some sort of impact on following wines. And yes, part of that oxygen, Ken, is the angel share, the top off, is a whole part of the process of winemaking, where the angel share, if anyone's not familiar with that, it's the fact that water and wine and alcohol will actually evaporate through there, because if you can let oxygen in, things can evaporate out. So alcohol specifically will evaporate out of that barrel, and then slowly the amount of wine that's in that barrel will be reduced. And as you're making your wine, you have to then top it off, because you don't want to leave too much oxygen in the barrel. You really want it to be as little amount of oxygen in the barrel as possible, to make that oxygen interaction as just very minimal as possible, because it's really kind of about that micro integration. So yes, the top off and the process of topping off will introduce more oxygen into the wine. So it's part of the also winemaking process, the racking process, the sort of the top off process. All of these elements and how you choose to do them will have a different amount of oxygen that they introduce to the wine, in addition to the oxygen that's being introduced through the barrel usage. And then sometimes turning the barrels and taking a sliver off the inside to start over. John, it's really interesting, because one of the things that's been a very big issue with oak barrels, and specifically French oak, but also American oak in general, they're very, very expensive. And especially if you want to use new oak and you want to get the kind of flavors from the newly toasted oak, people have experimented with taking barrels and sort of shaving off the inside layer and replacing that with thin staves of toasted wood. just as part of that. I would say, I don't know how successful that is really. I think ultimately there's no substitute for just a new, complete, fresh barrel, right? It's like anything else. Like, how are you attaching that? Are you using some sort of glue? How is that glue going to then kind of integrate into the wine? How will that affect it? I feel like, yes, it is definitely possible. And I definitely know that people have tried that. I think the success is really kind of not as advertised, because I don't know that it's necessarily been as successful as they would like, if you know what I mean. And then finally, barrel size. So when you're talking about that oxygen coming in through the wood and affecting the wine, it also has to do with the surface area. So the smaller the barrel, the more oxygen interaction you're going to get with that wine. The larger the barrel, the more surface area that there is with from the wine to surface area of the barrel. And so not as much of that wine actually touches the barrel and sees the oxygen. So you have less oxygenation in larger vessels than you do in smaller vessels. Smaller vessels increases the amount of surface area ratio of wood to wine. So therefore you get more wood flavors and more oxygen interaction when you're using a smaller barrel. Oh yes, wood chips. So interesting that you mentioned that, Ken, because I was just about to mention that. And staves. So again, oak is really expensive, and I haven't put out a number there yet, but I mean, you can spend upwards of $2,000 on a new French oak barrel. And when you think about how many barrels are used in a winery in a year who want to use 100% new French oak, you can see how that will add up very, very, very quickly, which also leads to high prices in wine and leads to just sort of expense for a winery. I mean, just also the sheer, if you need to use 100% new oak every year and you're replacing those every year, like that's pretty crazy. It's a lot of money that goes into that. A lot of times when you're tasting wines, or you'll hear them say like 25% new oak, and I'm like, how do you know that, right? But usually it's because a lot of winemakers, especially in the old world, you hear that in Burgundy a lot, will replace a quarter of the barrels every year. So basically for each vintage, a quarter are brand new, a quarter are second use, a quarter are third use, and a quarter are 4 years. So that's kind of how they kind of rotate their barrels in that way. And then all of those different aged wines in different barrels are then blended together. So that means that it's not 100% new, but it's a blend of different aging processes, which is also another way in which you create that final cuvee that's perfect for it. But let's say, for example, that you are making wine and you can't afford brand new French oak barrels because it's really, really expensive. Then what do? You go ahead and you use exactly that. Sometimes you can use things like oak staves or oak chips. So in that case, you have a stainless steel or inert vessel, and you're inserting these toasted wooden staves or toasted chips, as we can see in the picture here. And these will have flavor. They will have the flavor, and they will have the sort of toasted qualities. They'll have some of the chemical components that you'll find in toasted barrels to then introduce those flavors to the wine. But what you will not get from this particular process is the introduction of oxygen, which also affects, again, as we've talked about, that sort of integration of the flavors and also the evolution of the wine itself. You can achieve that by using oak chips or oak staves, and then a process called micro-oxygenation, which is essentially sort of pumping up these tiny, tiny little bubbles through there. It's an expensive process, though, less expensive sometimes than all like buying new oak barrels every year, which is, you know, good for some people depending on how much wine you're making, right? But another thing that is used, although I feel like it's not recommended, and I'm sure some of you have probably tried this and been like, why does this taste so funny? Oak essence. So it's essentially just basically like oak oil that can be added into the wine. And you know, it's like adding a syrup to a beverage, right? You know, it's not going to have the same effect as the actual product. It's kind of like a, you know, artificial flavoring, if you will, of oak. Can be used in wine. So Therese, an oak barrel, it can be anywhere from $1,000 to $1,500 per barrel on the low end. Like I said, some French wine barrels can be over $2,000. What you're seeing generally is that your American barrels are going to be much cheaper for a couple of reasons. One, because yes, it is. American oak is cheaper for a couple of reasons. One, as I mentioned, the process for making oak, you can cut it with a saw, which makes it much easier and much more economical to stave, to create those staves. Whereas with French oak, you have to actually hand separate the wood in order to make the staves. It's just the way that the wood is naturally grown. The other thing is that American oak is oftentimes kiln dried, like we talked about. So it's put into the kiln to dry it and season it, as opposed to leaving it outside for 3 to 5 years. That time that that wood has to stay outside, that increases how expensive that barrel is, right? Because that's time. It's just like aging your wine. Wine in a cellar does not produce money, right? You can't sell it if it's aging, unless it's in your personal cellar. But as a winemaker, if you age your wine, you are losing money because you're taking up the space to age that, and you're also losing money on selling it until it's ready. So same thing with the oak, for these barrels. Yes, American oak can be cheaper, but again, it imparts different flavors and it has different qualities that will change the wine in a different way than French oak will. And how does it do that? So the flavors that we get from oak that we talk about. So yes, the oxygen will help to sort of evolve that, soften tannins, integrate with the wine, help to start that evolutionary process early on, but also those flavors that you get from oak. The aroma of oak or oakiness, and those are derived from these lipids that actually exist in the oak that will tend to come out more through the toasting. So the toasting process sort of releases these flavors, these lactones, which are a very common one that we talk about. Lactones are found more specifically in American oak. They are more coconut-like at higher concentrations, and they have more kind of vanillin qualities. So when we're talking about American oak versus French oak, how can you tell? A lot of times it's based on the quality of the aroma and the flavors that you're getting. So you'll hear a lot of times with American oak that you'll get more of that kind of dill note and coconut note. And these come directly from the lactones that are within the wood. And the lactone quotient just happens to be higher within American oak than it is within French oaks or European oaks. It's also part of the toasting process. How heavily it's toasted will increase that, and then to a certain point decrease it. So especially when we're talking about these kind of vanillins that are being pulled out through the toasting process, as you toast it, the amount of those vanillins extracted increases until a certain point, and then it starts to decrease as you get more toasted into it. So it's very interesting. And then it's also the fact that, like, if you're fermenting your wine in the barrel, that will have a very different, the fermentation in the barrel will actually change how much that's impacted into the wine. So you could be using, let's say you have the same toasted wine, or same toasted oak, and it's American oak, and you're using it on your wine, and exact same grapes from the exact same vineyard, the exact same year, and in one you choose to ferment it and age it in the barrel, and the other one you're fermenting it in stainless steel and then you're aging it in the barrel, you're going to have a totally different experience, even though the wood is the same, and the amount of lactones that are inherently in the wood that came out in the toast, because they're both toasted exactly the same, you're going to have different wine because the fermentation process is going to change how those chemical compounds are being integrated into the wine. So it's a really important not only to know what kind of wood is being used, but how it's being used in the wine, because that will ultimately inform the end product of the wine that you're using. So French oak, when we talk about it, or European oak specifically, but mostly French oak, we're talking about, you tend to get more notes of those spices, like the spices, the toasted nuts, coffee. You tend to get sort of silkier tannins with that, because again, you're getting a little bit more oxygen through the tighter grain, which is helping to kind of smooth out those tannins. It's helping them to develop a little bit more. And so that is another main difference that you get on the textural feel of the wines. But again, it's not just a matter of what kind of oak is being used, it's how it's being used. When is it being introduced? How is it toasted? What forest did that wood come from? And if you want to get super geeky about it, you can actually get so geeky. I cannot do that. I cannot taste a wine and tell you what forest in France that oak came from. I am not there yet, maybe someday, but I don't even know if I can handle that. That's a lot, but it's possible, because that is how difference, just like terroir makes such a difference for an individual grape, that same sort of theory is applied and can be and is justified in applying to the wood that we used in oak. So we've got here the average cost. The effective. So is the effect of fermenting in the barrel due to CO2 extraction of the oak volatiles? Part of it is, so the effect of fermenting in the barrel and how that changes it, it has to do with the fact that fermentation is already a chemical process is taking place, right? If you will, because it is the process of that yeast taking the sugars, changing it into alcohol. But as the yeast does that, as the yeast is uptaking the sugars from the wine itself and creating that process, converting it, it allows for byproducts already. And we talk about that in the aromas of wine. We talk about how byproducts of the fermentation process create the things that we smell. But that's also because of those individual little subparticles that are within the juice, in the must itself with the sugar. And if you're fermenting in oak, that's going to be introducing other particulates that are not native to the grape itself. So therefore, as the fermentation process happens, that's going to change. It's going to create new and different aromas, but it's also going to create it as the alcohol is being created, and it's going to be part of the wine longer, which allows it to be integrated more smoothly sometimes and a little bit more effectively so that it doesn't feel as harsh or as obvious, right? So it's not necessarily a CO2 extraction of the oak volatiles. I think it's more of just the fact that the oak volatiles and also just the oak chemical compounds, because we're also talking about phenolics. We're talking about other chemical compounds other than volatiles specifically that are part of the oak that are in the must because of that. And the average cost of a French barrel and what is the percent of that cost is the actual materials, and what percent of that cost is labor in making the barrel. I mean, I think that really depends. Gosh, it depends on the cooper, right? So I would say, I mean, the average cost of a new French barrel is between $1,500 and $2,000 per barrel. How much of that has to do with the actual materials? It depends. Like, what cooper are you using? Are they actually, is that cooper, did you walk into that wood with that cooper? Did you go into there and pick out your tree? Are you having that wine, or are you having that wood seasoned in the open air for 18 months or for 5 years, and you're paying for that process as part of it? So again, the percentage of the cost of labor of making the barrel, I think, I mean, I think it's a high part of it, to be perfectly honest, versus the quality of the wood versus the making of it. I mean, that's going to be even. And like anything else, it's going to depend on what you're talking about. Like if you're going to a good cooper with who's sourcing really, really high quality wood, then that's going to increase your cost, right? But in terms of actual percentages for the both of them, I couldn't speak to that specifically or directly other than what I've already said, I guess. I hope that works, Dawn. I hope that makes sense. So that is it. I just want to say thank you, everyone, so much for coming to our little presentation on oak. I hope it was informative. It's definitely like a lot of good stuff in there, right? It just sort of opens your, I just feel like every time I start doing these things, it's just like more and more, it's like, there's so much more. Every stone you turn, there's like 24 stones underneath it. You're like, but there's that. It's very exciting, and I get super excited about it. But I forgot to mention, I know we talked about this briefly, but I wanted to show you, I've got this beautiful little Napa Valley Cabernet 2015. And this guy, this one actually is super interesting. You'll see this too. A lot of the wineries, because again, oak is like seasoning, they'll actually do blends of different oaks. So this particular wine is using French oak mostly, but with some American. It's using with a little bit of Russian oak as well. So that kind of mixing and matching, right? It's like, what do you want from this? How do you blend that? It's all about kind of the blending process to create exactly what you want. So, but I'm definitely on this. I think part of what makes those Napa Cabs is you know, you tend to get a lot more of that oak quality sort of more pervasive in the front. Mixing oak, generally speaking, it's the idea of like you can use, it's different parcels, right? You take the some of the wine, you age it in a French oak barrel. You take some of the wine, you age it in a Hungarian oak, and then you mix those two finished wines together. Or there are actually some wineries that are experimenting with barrels that have staves from multiple different kinds of oak in them. That's a little bit less common, I think. I think it depends. That's more of an experimental kind of thing. Mostly you're going to have kind of the same thing. That's it. Thank you all so much. I will let you enjoy the rest of your evening. So take care. Cheers, everyone. Bye.